Welcome to the second episode of this special three-part series where I talk to experts about issues in climate change and international security. I'm Clint Watts, a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And my thanks to Aaron Stein and the listeners of Chain Reaction for this second opportunity. Excessive heat, heavier rains, worsening natural disasters. Devastation from climate change is already a reality across the world and is prompting people to reckon with the question, do I stay or do I go? Today we'll talk to Dr. Jola Ajibade, Assistant Professor of Geography at Portland State University in Oregon, about what goes into people's decisions to migrate and what kind of innovations and adaptations people are making to cope with the rapidly changing climate. Jola, when did you start thinking about climate and how has it affected you personally?
Yeah, thank you. That's a brilliant question, partly because now you're making me think exactly to pinpoint when it was where I became aware that that's something different from when the impact started, which may mean that I wasn't aware that it was climate change, but then we had the impact, right? So I will start with when we had the impact of some of the frequent flooding was quite, I would say when I was much more, maybe younger, where our home would repeatedly flood. I lived in Lagos, grew up in Lagos, but we knew that every year the flood increased and expanded even spatially across the city. But we never attributed it to climate change. We thought it was just, more rain, precipitation, whatever it was. And so when I moved to Canada, I think it must have been in my late 20s. And I was going to do a program called the Survey Program. I was going to work on corruption and human rights, which was a big issue in my country. But when I got to Canada, people started talking about environment, and I started reading, like, what are the big issues? What's going on? How can we understand all of these issues, not just around pollution, but also what's changing about the environment, and then thinking about what's changing in my own country. And, I started reading about climate change, and it became obvious to me that a lot of the things that I thought was just flooding, or that we just thought it was getting hotter, it wasn't just happening in Lagos. It was happening in many other places as well. And that was when I started making the connections that we do have a bigger challenge at hand. And so I went back to school then for my PhD, which was really in environmental studies and geography. And I focused on climate change issues, trying to understand the relationship between climate change and flooding, but also how flooding then exacerbates, inequalities in housing, inequalities in access to food and health, and particularly for women.
So I've got too many questions all at once. So let's start with Lagos.
Yeah.
How has it changed in Lagos, let's say over the last decade or 2 decades? How is it different from what would be normal in Nigeria?
So 20 years ago, and I'm not that old to say, but when I was younger, yes, we did get flooded, as I was mentioning, but the flooding were maybe concentrated in certain areas that typically were maybe slums or were around the beach or on the coast. But when I did my PhD and went back to study this, the flooding was all over the city. It wasn't one place. It wasn't isolated flooding. It was flooding where it rained, and then you have also storm surges, and the water goes everywhere. So it wasn't about the poor people getting flooded. It was everybody, whether you were poor, you were rich, you were living in mansion. It really didn't matter. And that's what we're seeing continuously going on in Lagos, that the flood is going everywhere. The water is going everywhere. So that's one problem. But we're also seeing the intensity. So when it does rain, it can be very heavy. So we see this massive flash flood that gets everywhere flooded. And we also see that it's hard to plan our seasons right because of this variability and changes over time. And it's so funny when people say we need to convince people that climate change is happening, and it just makes me laugh. Because you don't need to convince people of evidence, what is we're seeing.
Right.
So that's the thing with the climate change, where if it's not close to home, people may be debating it, but when you begin to see those changes around you, then you wonder, what are you debating when it's obvious? It's, empirical. It's something we can see and test and measure and see the impact. And that's what it is.
I feel it now. You're a professor now in Portland. How would you describe your focus in terms of, you're in the Department of Geography, but what is your focus when it comes to climate change right now?
So there's a variety of ways to think about climate change, but one of the key issues for me, it's really the social injustices in terms of the people responsible or historical responsibility from certain states, but also people who are heavily impacted. There's also another lens that I look at, which is the political ecology lens, is what we call it. And this lens actually brings together issues around the political and economic system that drives the impact of climate change, the actors who are really, involved in the polluting industries, but also the people who have or do not have the power to challenge those people, to say, let's stop reducing greenhouse gas emission. Let's tackle climate change. Let's make our world better and greener, and let's reduce energy consumption. So I look at all of these multiple dimensions where social justice is very centered in the work that I do, but also trying to engage the different political systems, including the economic system that continues to fuel this problem, and also the culture. There is an heavy culture, especially in the West, where people focus so much on freedom, and they forget that excessive freedom without some ways in which we have to manage or maybe make our freedom become subservient within the environment, the carrying capacity of environment, who will ultimately lose their freedom. So people go like, yeah, I just want to do what I want. We want capitalism to run on a steroid. And if we keep doing that, we're going to destroy the environment ultimately, and we wouldn't even have the kind of life we want. And so all of these big picture issues, I look at them in my work, but then I also bring them down. What does it mean for the individual? What does it mean for particular cities where I'm working? And what does it mean for communities who are on the front line experiencing the impact of climate change very viscerally, actually?
So this is exactly where I wanted to jump off at, which is in your research and writing, you talk a lot about the difference between climate relocation and managed retreat. Which are two terms that I'm definitely going to use from here on out because they're wildly different. But can you explain that difference between the two, climate relocation and managed retreat?
I talked about the difference between climate migration and managed retreat. And managed retreat is people relocating from a particular area because of the impact of climate change and moving into an area that is relatively safe. The idea of climate migration is actually a bigger terminology in terms of people moving. In some of this migration is fueled by climate change. Some are climate change mixed with a lot of things, right? So climate change mixed with things like political instability in a particular country, food insecurity, which of course is a climate change issue in some countries. And there is also the issue of gangs in some countries, the issue of conflict. And so when you think about climate migration, there are multiple types of drivers that actually lead to people to move, and climate might be an element within that collection of drivers. And so people may relocate because of wildfire, they may relocate because of flooding or sea level rise or droughts. And then in many of the case studies that I've seen across the world, including where I work, you may see situations where the government support people to relocate. There are debates about whether the relocation provides the people the kind of livability they want, the kind of education, access to resources, healthcare, all of those things that matter to them. Those conversations are there, but the relocation process and the actors involved and how it happens on ground is very much different from how the climate migration happens. And the driver of the relocation is often very clear. A lot of the relocations I've seen where I work, it's often that flood or storm, one thing, and not necessarily mixed with conflicts or with gang or drugs related issues that we've seen in some other countries. But for me, though, when people ask me this question, I do see that in both cases there are vulnerability, but I think it's far more higher for people who are migrating, partly because they don't get a lot of support, and because within the international arena, there is even no definition, like no legal terminology that protects people. So there is this debate about whether people should be called climate migrants, climate refugees, or environmental refugees. There is no terminology that is clear, and there is no document that mandates country to make sure that people involved in this are protected and given appropriate support to get to places that will be safe and homes that will be safe. I think we need both political and international support at multiple levels to make sure that people migrating do so safely.
I'm going to kind of dive into both of those phenomena that you're talking about, but I wanted to start with climate migration. Looking at this, there's a couple factors, right? The individual decision to move. At the same point, is there even really a choice, I think, in certain circumstances? So what kind of considerations do you see potential climate migrants make in choosing to stay or go? What are the big determinants?
Oh my, that's a heavy question. Do people have a choice to migrate or to stay? I don't know. I honestly don't think people migrating have a choice.
Right.
Because if they did have a choice that was viable, and they felt that their homes and that their family will be safe where they had, that they will have access to the livelihood and all other things that will make their life productive, they would definitely say. Most people don't want to relocate from their country. I mean, I didn't want to leave Nigeria, for instance, even though I'm not a climate migrant in the sense we're discussing it. But you want to be where your family is. You want to be where you've always grown up. A lot of people want that. People start to move when they feel that their lives are threatened, where the country seems unstable, where they feel that there is very limited future for the types of goals they want for their lives. And then when there's the impact of climate change making things worse, then it feels like, okay, I'd rather die trying than not doing anything. And I don't even think it's a choice. It's almost a forced situation that you just have to survive. And it's a survival mechanism. It's an adaptation mechanism for a lot of people, quite frankly.
So, Jola, one more aspect of this before we move towards the managed retreat portion I wanted to ask you is, in international refugee laws, climate migrants get no recognition or legal protection. So how does this affect people's decision to move, or does it at all? Do you think any of these considerations are there for people when they decide to take the leap and move?
I just laugh because, we discuss a lot of international law, and we assume that a lot of people that are moving don't even know which laws these laws
Right.
are.
That's why I was curious about it, because I can't imagine that if I was in a crisis situation like that and I had to make a decision to move, that I'm trying to validate my status. It's just interesting. I'm in New York, and I see UN folks, and I talk to government, and they'll talk about these policy sort of things. So I just wondered what you thought about that and whether we should even focus on those kinds of things and policy interventions when at the root core of it seems like climate change is happening. We talked about that. Everyone kind of knows it. Is this even worth discussing really at this point, or where should we be focusing at in terms of policy?
I think we should think about who are the people moving. So if you think about the categories of people moving, and that ends up being not protected within this international system where we're talking about, a lot of them are the most vulnerable people. A lot of them are the poorest of the poor. A lot of them are the least educated. They are not necessarily the people who have the right information or the support from government or from NGOs or whatnot. And so they're not aware of all of these categorizations about whether they will be protected or not. For many of them, it's about survival. I have to get somewhere. And so that's one issue we have to think about, that, we are dealing with the most vulnerable groups in the world, quite frankly. They are on multiple levels. So to your second question, what should we think about in terms of policy? I think it's high time that the international community actually recognizes the need for protection of climate migrants. We do need a protection mechanism to be able to cover and protect people who are migrating, and how they can safely migrate, and which countries should be taking in a lot of climate migrants, and how to resettle them within the new countries that they'll be going to. We're all humans, right? How do we ensure safe migration for people? How do we ensure they are resettled properly within countries that have the resources and the capacity to help them build better lives?
So now I want to switch to the other end of the perspective, which is countries have resources, or some countries are planning. In the U.S., we are trying to make adaptations to coming climate change, or at least we say we're going to. We move pretty slow here in America. We don't like doing anything in the U.S. until it's already a disaster, and we kind of move real fast then, and it's a mess. But you talk about managed retreat as a form of adaptation. I feel like I am already part of managed retreat. I'm starting to think about these things in my own, personal life. You mentioned New Clark City. It's a second city, if I'm correct, built inland as a planned retreat point from Manila in the Philippines. Can you talk a bit about these climate topias, or a form of climate adaptation? Are there case studies we should look at that are ingenious and we should start thinking about that? Or are there really just pitfalls, in this whole concept of managed retreat that we need to really kind of avoid and get some perspective about?
So you've asked a loaded question here. So climatopias are different from regular relocation, where people build homes that are safer for low-income communities in some cases, or for everyday people. Those are conventional ways of relocating people to a newer area within the city, or outside of the city, or within the rural areas, whatnot. The climatopias, these are not necessarily for poor people. These are cities that people are trying to build from the scratch, which, with mega structures that are very shiny and beautiful and said to be very tech savvy, and technology runs everything. And no poor person can afford there, neither is the government moving people there. They're kind of doing what is counter to what you may think would help adaptation. So those that are going to the climatopia, some of them are not even going through all of the struggles with climate change. They are just, I want a better, fancier, smart tech, greener, whatever place to go, and I have money to buy it, and then let's just go do it, or let's go there. Whereas for a lot of people that are relocating based on managed retreat or climate relocation, these are a relocation of necessity. It is not a luxury-based relocation. And so for those people, for some of them, if they don't move from where they currently are living, they are likely to face more losses than they faced in the past, whether it's their home being destroyed, people falling sick, all sort of impacts that people go through. And those type of relocation, it's necessary for people sometimes who have to leave those homes or those locations and move elsewhere. And so it's not based on luxury, it's necessity.
So thinking of that, in terms of managed retreat, are there ones that you have seen so far that seem very forward-thinking, that make sense? Are there case studies that we can look at and sort of think of? Do you see, maybe it's countries or maybe it's even states in the U.S. where the idea of managed retreat is already well in place and you're seeing what seems to be a smart way to think about how do we make a better life for everybody as climate change is just impending?
Yeah, great question. I think managed retreat is happening more, and I think there are a number of successful cases. We just need to do it right. I have a group of students that I've been working with on trying to track not just the number of managed retreats happening in the world, but actually which ones are successful. And we were able to identify about 60 of them, but we categorized them in different ways because each of those cases or sets of cases are not necessarily the same. In the US here, there are two main dominant patterns that we've seen. There is a compensatory case, which is the one you're saying where people get paid or want the government to buy their homes out. And then when they get that buyout, then they move to where they want to or where they feel that it might be safer for them. That's sort of like the dominant approach in the US and in some other Western countries. It's really the buyouts, which is sort of giving the people the autonomy to move to where they want. But there are some other instances where we call it the reformative one, where communities come together and they relocate as a group. You pull the resources together, maybe get some resources from the government. You're like, okay, we want to move. We've seen some of this example in Puerto Rico, where the communities came together to relocate after a major flood. They created a land trust. They built the homes themselves, and the people decided who was going to get which homes. And so that was very much people-driven, but it worked. And the relocation allowed them to have access to better resources, to repair the land, but also to get access to schools and whatnot for their families and for their children, rather. And there's another example that we also really thought was a stellar example. This was in Brazil, where a community called the Hacienda community, where after a major flood, they wanted to relocate. They reached out to the government. The government didn't want to relocate them or didn't have the resources at the time. And then they took the case to the court. They won, but then after they won, the government said, we're not going to give you money. Yes, you won, but we're not going to give you money. Sort out your relocation yourself. But then women came together in that community to actually mobilize, and they did some kind of charity event to raise money. And they did that for a while. They raised the resources and they, made this relocation happen for their communities. So there are a lot of examples that are successful, even though there are struggles for communities in getting this done, but we're seeing some progress and good results happening.
Yes. So interesting, right? Portland, Oregon. 19 years ago, I started as a new FBI agent in Portland, Oregon, right there.
FBI agent? Why am I talking to an FBI agent?
Don't worry. It's not, I'm not working for him now. And so I was right down the street from Portland State. I actually walked through the campus a few times to do work and things like that. But Portland in 2002 was very different from Portland in 2022, right? There were no air conditioners in Portland 20 years ago. Nowadays, you better have an air conditioner. I think you had record temperatures. So you're actually in one of these points where you're seeing a massive shift, right, in terms of the climate. How does it feel where you're at now? You notice it just from the time you've been there, and how is it with the folks that live there with forest fires? It's really a dynamic location for this.
I've been here just 4 years. And yes, the Eats was a record-breaking event that we had earlier this year. For me personally, the one we had this year was really, really devastating as well because I couldn't stay in my house. My air conditioning stopped working. It was so hot, and we had to move to an hotel for a day or two. And it's true. The challenge is this going to be the new normal?
I can't even fathom that, having lived there, at one point where it's mostly rainy and dark and cloudy when I was there, and how dynamically it's changed in a very short time.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating. I should say that you've been to two climate hotspots now, right? Lagos and Portland, Oregon. One international, one domestic. So that leads me into my last question. Where is Jola in 2040? Where do you want to be when the climate apocalypse hits, Jola?
This is a question that fits into something that we've been struggling with. This is me and my husband. Okay, so I've received a lot of job recruitment from a lot of schools, about 3 Ivy League schools and several other universities that, that everybody wants to be. Like, oh, this is a great school, I want to be there. And one of the things that featured into my decision making of not accepting those recruitment offers is because I'm thinking, no, I don't want to live here. What's the weather going to be like in 5-10 years? What is going on already in those places? But the other thing, though, that we do have in terms of when we're thinking about even Portland, where I am, we have a chance of an earthquake in the next 50 years. So the question of where is safe is a question that I think we will constantly have to ask ourselves.
Sure.
Because you may even think, I'm running away from the climate impact, but there are also geological impacts in some places that may seem safe. But you know how devastating earthquakes can be.
Yeah, Haiti, for example, repeated earthquakes. That's part of the migration pattern, that we see even here in the U.S.
Yeah, so there is a projection that the 9.0 magnitude earthquake is likely to happen within now and 50 years, I think. And so parts of Oregon, California, including Vancouver, is likely to experience this. And so the question is, where is safe? Where do you find that safety? I don't know. Maybe some places are safe for a certain period, and then not so much for another period. And I think people have to become flexible in how we interpret risks and safety and maybe make the right decisions, whatever those decisions will be. But I don't know where I'll be in 2040 is a simple answer to your question. I have no idea. I just hope I'm still here, though, and maybe talking to younger people about how we did address climate change and how our world became better because we did something. I think that's what I hope I will be talking about then, and not that we didn't do anything. If I were to think about where we are now and if we continue on the trajectory, I don't think I'll be very happy wherever I am. But if we do something now to mitigate climate change, to help people to adapt, to find safe havens for people who are migrating, I think 2040 will be a better year for me.
I hope you're right, Joel, and I thank you for working on this. And now I totally want to know what Ivy League schools you turned down because you weren't feeling good about the weather. All right. Anything else I should have asked, Joel? Any last comments or thoughts?
I think one of the key things that I'm interested in, and maybe I think people should be thinking about, is the issue of this multiple disasters happening. There is the impact of climate change that sometimes people think about as disparate incidents where you had the flood and then we think it's just a flood. But then cities and people experiencing these disasters one after the other, and sometimes simultaneously. And that's a new area of work that I'm trying to understand. What is this relationship between multiple disasters and how are people dealing with it? Do we have the resources and support to be able to help community build resilience? And are we doing that in an equitable way? And are we also centering justice? Are we centering, racial inequities that have always been in the system that makes this impact more severe for people of color, particularly more severe for women as well, more severe for children, for the elderly? How are we designing our resilience policies to address the impact of climate change? And so centering justice, centering especially racial justice, gender equity, and attention to children as well. How do we help children to deal with this trauma of changing climate? Many of us did not grow up in this very hot weather, but our children are doing so. How do we help them understand what's going on? So I hope that somehow we can collectively build resilience, but centering people who are often marginalized and people who are relatively vulnerable.
That was Dr. Jola Ajibade, Assistant Professor of Geography at Portland State University in Oregon. On the next and final episode of our special series on climate change, I'll talk with Jesse Keenan, an associate professor of real estate at Tulane University in New Orleans. We'll discuss how climate change will specifically affect those in the United States and where people might move to when some parts of the world and America become unlivable. This episode was produced by Sophia James and Sophia Kurzius. I'm Clint Watts at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and you can follow me on Twitter at the username @SelectedWisdom. Thanks for listening.